I want to start with something that happened on a Monday that almost nobody in the mainstream press led with. Not the major American networks, not the BBC. They were all focused on the blockade, on the ships, on the presidential social media posts threatening to eliminate Iranian fast attack boats. And I understand why. Those are dramatic, those are visual, those are the things that get clipped and shared and talked about on panel shows for 3 hours. But while all of that was happening, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, the man who has been Vladimir Putin's public voice for over 2 decades, stood in front of reporters in Moscow and said something that I believe is the most important sentence spoken about this war in the past week. He said that Russia's offer, the offer to take Iran's enriched uranium off Iranian soil, out of Iranian hands, and store it inside Russia as part of a peace architecture that could end this conflict, still stands. He said it was proposed by Putin in direct contacts with the United States and with regional states, and he said it has not been acted upon. And America's response to that offer as of today? Silence. Not a rejection, not an acceptance, not a counter-proposal. Silence. I want to spend the next 20 minutes explaining to you why that silence is the most consequential thing happening in this conflict right now. Not the blockade, not the failed talks in Islamabad, not the presidential threats about power plants and bridges, the silence, because that silence is not nothing. That silence is a choice, and that choice, depending on what drives it, either ends this war within days or extends it past a deadline that expires on April 21st with consequences that nobody has fully mapped out yet. Let me start where this all begins, not on the Monday when Peskov made his statement, but much further back, because you cannot understand why Russia's uranium offer matters today unless you understand the full shape of what came before it. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched what the American military designated Operation Epic Fury. It was one of the largest joint military operations in history, nearly 900 strikes executed in approximately 12 hours, targeting Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and the highest levels of Iranian leadership. The opening wave killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, assassinated alongside dozens of officials in a decapitation strike that the world had not seen coming at that scale or that speed. And in those same opening hours, a missile struck a girls' school in the town of Manab, near the port city of Bandar Abbas in southern Iran. Approximately 170 civilians were killed. I mention that detail not for legal reasons, not for rhetorical points, but for a human reason. It is part of why Iran has been unwilling to simply accept whatever terms are put in front of it. Wars that kill children in schools do not produce governments eager to publicly surrender. Iran's response was immediate and massive. Hundreds of retaliatory ballistic missiles, thousands of drones, attacks on U.S. bases and Gulf infrastructure across the region, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway, barely 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil moves every single day. For the weeks that followed, that war continued. Strikes, counterstrikes, fragile pauses, broken pauses, more strikes. 13 American service members have been killed. Thousands of Iranians are dead, including more than 1,000 confirmed civilians. Lebanon has experienced some of its worst bombardment in decades. Global oil prices rose more than 30% after the war began and have remained elevated, squeezing households in every country on earth. On April 7th and 8th, a fragile 2-week ceasefire was brokered through the extraordinary diplomatic effort of Pakistan. That window expires on April 21st. And inside that 6-day window, everything orbits around one single question, a question that has broken every round of negotiations going back not just to this war, but to every serious conversation between America and Iran for years. That question is, what happens to Iran's enriched uranium? Let me explain why this question is so hard and why it has broken every deal so far. Iran possesses roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to approximately 60% purity. That figure comes from the International Atomic Energy Agency's own verified reporting, and the detail matters enormously. 60% enrichment is not weapons grade. Weapons grade is above 90%, but 60% is what nuclear weapons analysts have described for years as perilously close. With functioning centrifuges, a country at 60% enrichment is a matter of weeks away from weapons usable material if it decides to push. The IAEA has been explicit about this risk. The stockpile, if further enriched, could theoretically yield enough fissile material for multiple nuclear devices. That is why this particular number, 440 kilograms at 60%, is the number that has driven American policy, Israeli strategy, and now Russian opportunism, all at the same time. What America has been demanding, confirmed by multiple credible sources across outlets including CNN, Axios, and The Washington Post, is that Iran permanently end all uranium enrichment, dismantle its major nuclear facilities, and physically remove that stockpile from Iranian territory entirely. Not reduce it, not dilute it, remove it. Take it out of the country and relinquish control of it. What Iran has been offering is a temporary pause. In the negotiations in Islamabad last weekend, Iran tabled a moratorium of 5 years, after which Iran would reassert its sovereign right to enrich uranium under the framework of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. America's negotiating team in Islamabad proposed 20 years. Iran countered with 5. Those positions are not close, and the gap between them, 15 years and a fundamentally different concept of permanence, was the reason that 21 hours of talks in Islamabad produced no agreement. And then came the twist that tells you everything about the current moment. Speaking to the New York Post on Tuesday, the day after the Islamabad talks collapsed, President Trump said he does not like the 20-year proposal that his own negotiating team put on the table. His words were, "I've been saying they can't have nuclear weapons, so I don't like the 20 years. Think carefully about what that means." The American negotiating position going into Islamabad was a 20-year suspension. The President of the United States publicly rejected his own team's proposal the day after those talks failed, which raises an unavoidable question: what exactly is the American position? Because if not 20 years, then what? Permanent dismantlement? A complete, indefinite, unilateral surrender of Iran's nuclear infrastructure? Because that is precisely what Iran's side has been calling maximalism. That is what Iranian officials have described as shifting goalposts. And Trump's Tuesday comment is the clearest evidence yet that the goalposts have indeed moved, not because Iran moved them, but because the President of the United States himself is unsatisfied with what his own negotiators offered. This is the exact moment Russia chose to speak. And I want you to understand why that timing is not coincidental. Russia has 3 distinct interests in this war, and each of them is served by stepping forward right now. The first is economic. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has pushed global oil prices up significantly since the war began. Russia is one of the world's largest oil exporters. Every dollar that oil rises is direct revenue flowing into the Russian government's coffers, funding the war in Ukraine and insulating the Russian economy from the weight of Western sanctions. A quick peace deal that reopens Hormuz tomorrow is not actually in Russia's immediate economic interest. A prolonged conflict that keeps oil elevated serves Russia's treasury very well indeed. The second interest is geopolitical, and it is the more important one. Russia and Iran have been drawing strategically closer for years, a relationship accelerated by the fact that both countries operate under extensive Western sanctions, and both have found themselves on the same side of a widening confrontation with the Western-led international order. Russia has supplied weapon systems to Iran. The top diplomat of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, stood at a G7 meeting and directly accused Russia of providing Iran with targeting intelligence. Intelligence used, in her words, to kill Americans. Russia wants influence over what post-war Iran looks like. Being the literal custodian of Iran's most sensitive nuclear material would give Russia extraordinary leverage simultaneously over Tehran and over Washington. Think about that dynamic for a moment. If Russia holds Iran's enriched uranium, every time America wants assurance that the material is secure, every time a new negotiation begins, every time a new crisis flares, America has to go to Moscow and ask. The dynamic of America needing something from Russia, of Moscow holding a card that Washington must acknowledge, is precisely the strategic posture that Putin has been trying to construct for years. The uranium does not just become a Middle East problem, it becomes a bargaining chip in every future conversation about Ukraine, about NATO expansion, about sanctions relief, about the entire architecture of the U.S.-Russia relationship. The third interest is the simplest. Russia wants to demonstrate in the most visible possible way that it is not isolated, that when the most complex geopolitical crisis of this decade reaches its decisive moment, Russia has something to offer that nobody else can provide. Holding Iran's enriched uranium would be the most tangible proof of strategic relevance that Moscow has been able to claim since the Cold War ended. So when Peskov made his statement on Monday, Russia was not extending a diplomatic courtesy. Russia was inserting itself as the indispensable third party in a negotiation that had just collapsed between two other parties. Russia was saying, "You cannot solve this without us." Now let me describe what Russia is actually proposing, because I think it has been reported in ways that are too vague to grasp its real significance. The proposal is not simply that Iran hands its uranium to Russia and everyone goes home. The proposal is that Russia acts as custodian of Iran's enriched uranium as part of a broader peace framework. Iran's uranium would be transferred to Russian territory and held under international monitoring. And here is the critical detail: Iran would retain, at least in theory, the political framing that the material is still technically Iranian, that Iran has not permanently surrendered its nuclear program, but has merely placed a portion of it in trust with a partner country. Russia has done this before. As part of the 2015 nuclear deal, Russia removed substantial quantities of enriched uranium from Iran and processed it into civilian reactor fuel. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, has explicitly confirmed it is prepared to do so again. This distinction between surrender and custodianship matters enormously to Iran's domestic politics. The entire argument for the nuclear program inside Iran across governments and decades has been built on the language of sovereignty, on the right of an independent nation to develop civilian nuclear technology, on refusing to submit to what Iranian officials consistently call foreign dictates from powers that do not wish Iran well. If Iran simply hands its uranium to America or destroys it entirely, the domestic political cost could be catastrophic, especially for a government already dealing with the assassination of its supreme leader, weeks of airstrikes, and a population that has endured extraordinary hardship. Russia's offer gives Iran a way to make a concession that does not look like total capitulation. The uranium is not destroyed. It is not handed to the adversary. It is placed with a partner country under conditions that preserve at least the theoretical possibility of it returning someday. That framing might be the difference between a deal that is politically survivable domestically and one that brings down whoever signs it. For America, the question is harder. Does Iran's uranium sitting in Russia actually solve the problem that America went to war to solve? The stated American position, repeated by the President, by Secretary of State Rubio, by Defense Secretary Hegseth, is that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. But the operational question is whether a stockpile sitting in Russian territory actually reduces that risk, or simply moves it geographically while leaving Iran's enrichment knowledge and centrifuge infrastructure entirely intact. There is a version of Russia's proposal that works for America. The stockpile is removed, international monitoring is restored, and the practical timeline to an Iranian nuclear weapon is extended significantly. And there is a version that does not work. Iran retains its centrifuges, retains all of its enrichment expertise, and can reconstitute its stockpile within months of any political decision to do so. The distance between those two versions of the same deal is the distance between something America can accept and something it cannot. And America has said nothing publicly about which version it believes Russia's offer represents. This is where I want to use a framework I think of as the silence taxonomy, because not all silences in diplomacy mean the same thing, and understanding what kind of silence America is maintaining toward Russia's offer is essential to understanding where the next 6 days go. There are 4 kinds of diplomatic silence. The first is thinking silence, the silence of a government that has received a proposal, is taking it seriously, is running it through its national security apparatus, and has not yet formed a final response. This is productive silence, the silence that precedes a deal. The second is tactical silence, the silence of a negotiator who understands that speaking publicly about a proposal gives the other side information about your level of interest. If America says publicly it finds Russia's offer interesting, Iran immediately knows it has leverage. If America says nothing, Iran cannot gauge how much the uranium transfer actually buys it in the broader negotiation. This kind of silence is strategic. It is a form of information control. The third is bureaucratic silence, the silence of an administration internally divided, where different factions hold different views on Russia's offer, where some see it as a workable bridge and others see it as a trap, and where no public statement can be made because there is no agreed internal position to state. This kind of silence is dangerous. It eats time, and time is exactly what this negotiation does not have. The fourth is rejecting silence, the silence of a government that has effectively decided it does not want the offer but does not want to say so publicly because formally rejecting it would close a door it might need to reopen. This is the most alarming kind. It means America has looked at Russia's proposal and concluded it is insufficient and has chosen not to say so, leaving the offer hanging unanswered while the ceasefire clock runs down. I do not know which of these 4 silences America is currently maintaining. Nobody outside a very small number of people in the White House and the State Department knows. But here is what I can tell you from what is publicly visible. Turkey's foreign minister is now involved. Egypt's foreign minister has been making contact with Washington's top diplomat. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif has confirmed that mediators are working to resolve the remaining differences. Trump himself has said that something could be happening in the coming days in Pakistan. That level of simultaneous diplomatic activity does not happen around a negotiation that has been quietly abandoned. It happens around a negotiation that every party involved believes is still barely salvageable. And Russia's uranium offer is sitting in the middle of all of it, publicly on the table, publicly unaddressed, as either the piece that could unlock everything or the offer America refuses to accept, which means nothing else unlocks either. Let me now make the April 21st deadline concrete because I think it has been treated as somewhat abstract in the coverage, and I want you to understand what actually happens if there is no deal and no extension. If the ceasefire expires without an agreement, several things happen simultaneously. The first is that the legal and political framework constraining American military action against Iran expires with it. The White House has been explicit. The president is considering resuming strikes if the current pressure does not produce Iranian flexibility. Targets reportedly include infrastructure that was threatened before the ceasefire, power plants, bridges, economic facilities. Defense Secretary Hegseth has publicly invoked Operation Midnight Hammer, the American operation that targeted Iran's nuclear facilities in June of last year, as a reference point for what resumed military action could look like. The implication was not subtle. If Iran does not reach a deal, America reserves the option to go back after whatever remains of Iran's nuclear infrastructure directly. The second is that Iran faces its own decision. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has already stated publicly that it considers certain American naval actions a ceasefire violation. Iranian officials have said the country still has capabilities it has not yet deployed and could introduce new tactics if the conflict deepens. Iran has mines. It has anti-ship missiles. It has fast attack boats in the Gulf. The decision not to use them in their full capacity has so far been political, a choice made inside a ceasefire framework. The day that framework expires, that political constraint changes. The third is what happens to the global economy. Oil markets have been showing fragile signs of stabilizing on hopes of a resolution. If the ceasefire collapses, those hopes collapse with it. Experts from multiple energy research bodies have concluded that prices will not fall significantly until the Strait of Hormuz is fully and reliably reopened and damaged oil infrastructure is repaired, a process that could take months even after a deal is reached. If the ceasefire breaks down, that timeline extends indefinitely, and the economic cost grows larger, falling hardest on countries in Asia, Africa, and South Asia that cannot absorb sustained oil price shocks the way wealthier economies can. Now back to Russia's offer, because after laying out everything above, the question that matters most is this. Is Russia's uranium proposal the actual bridge between where we are today and a deal that holds? The case that it is runs like this. If Iran transfers its stockpile of enriched uranium to Russia under an internationally monitored framework, the immediate weaponization risk that America declared as its central justification for war is removed. Not permanently, not structurally, not forever. Iran retains the knowledge and retains the infrastructure, but the material itself is no longer in Iran. That removes the most urgent military argument for continued pressure. It gives the president a tangible victory he can describe publicly and claim as a win. It gives Iran a concession it can present domestically as something other than unconditional surrender. And it gives Russia precisely what Russia wants, the indispensable intermediary role, the custodian of the most sensitive nuclear material in the most contested conflict on Earth. The case against runs like this. Iran's centrifuges remain. Iran's enrichment knowledge and human capital remain. Russia is not America's ally and has no obvious strategic incentive to restrict Iranian access to its own uranium in ways that serve American long-term interests. A deal built on Russia holding Iran's uranium is, at its foundation, a deal built on trusting Russia to be a responsible and transparent custodian of material that could, in changed circumstances, under a different diplomatic climate, find its way back to Iran or be leveraged in ways that extend rather than constrain Iranian nuclear ambitions. Both arguments are serious. Both reflect genuine strategic realities, and America has not publicly said which argument currently governs its thinking, which is precisely why the silence is so loud. One more thing, and it connects everything I have said. Trump told the New York Post he does not like the 20-year proposal. His words were unqualified. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. No time frame, no years, can't have them. Full stop. And a source close to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed that Vice President Vance, returning from Islamabad, told Netanyahu directly that the core American demand was not a moratorium of 20 or 30 years, but the removal of all enriched material from Iran and the assurance of no enrichment, and that this could mean decades. If that is the actual American position, not a 20-year pause, not a time-limited suspension, but a permanent, indefinite elimination of Iranian enrichment, then Russia's uranium offer, even if accepted in full, does not satisfy it. Because Russia's offer addresses the stockpile, it does not address the centrifuges. It does not address Iran's clear and consistent insistence that it will not permanently surrender what it describes as a sovereign right under international treaty. What that means, And this is the most alarming possibility sitting inside this week, is that America may be silent about Russia's proposal, not because it is still deliberating, but because it has already concluded that the offer does not solve the actual problem, and saying that publicly would collapse the last remaining diplomatic architecture before April 21st arrives. That is the hardest reading of this silence, that the blockade, the threatened talks, the mediators flying between capitals, all of it is aimed at forcing Iran to a position that Iran's leadership simply cannot accept without destroying itself politically. A regional source put it plainly this week: "We are not in a complete deadlock, the door is not closed yet, both sides are still bargaining." But the word the source chose was bizarre. Bizarre is an unusual word for a diplomat to use. It suggests something that does not follow normal logic. Something where the gap between the public performance of negotiation and the private reality of the positions is wider than anyone is willing to say out loud. Russia's uranium offer is sitting on the table unanswered. Trump says something could happen. Mediators from Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, and Oman are working simultaneously. Iran says it has unused capabilities. America says it reserves the right to strike again. And in the middle of all of it, Dmitry Peskov, standing in front of reporters in Moscow, says, "The offer still stands, but has not been acted upon." Watch what America says about that offer in the next 48 to 72 hours. Not what the president posts on social media, what the State Department says, what the Secretary of State says in his conversations with foreign ministers this week, what any American official says on the record about Russia's proposal, because the first moment America acknowledges that offer publicly, whether to accept it, reject it, or propose conditions, tells you more about where this war is going than any ship movement in the Strait of Hormuz. The silence will not last forever. 6 days is not long enough for silence to hold. Something breaks before April 21st. Either a deal is reached, a ceasefire is extended, or the war resumes. And the single variable most likely to determine which of those three outcomes happens is the question that has been sitting unanswered since Monday. What does America think about Russia's offer to take Iran's uranium? That question sounds simple. It is not simple. Behind it sits every unresolved tension of this war, between what America declared as its war aim and what Iran will actually agree to, between the pressure a blockade can realistically apply and the domestic political floor below which no Iranian government can descend without collapsing, between what Russia is genuinely offering as a diplomatic solution and what Russia is strategically gaining by offering it. All of those tensions run directly through the silence America is currently maintaining. 6 days. That is what remains before this ceasefire either holds or breaks. 6 days for America to decide whether Russia's proposal is a bridge or a trap. 6 days for Iran to decide whether the blockade has changed its calculation or simply hardened it. 6 days for mediators across 4 countries to find the language that lets both sides claim enough of a win to sell a deal at home. Push back on this if you see it differently. Read Peskov's statement. Read the reporting from Islamabad. Read what Trump told the New York Post about the 20-year proposal. Read what Vance reportedly told Netanyahu.